Very much. Now, first of all, I always say the same thing. I'm happy to be here because pretty much wherever I am, I'm usually happy to be there. But I'm particularly happy to be here today. I've spent many, many, many moments in this building and in this room and in this place, and some of the best times of my life were had right here. So, who am I, and why am I talking about this topic? Very briefly, every time I show up down here, I'm doing something else, so I'll give you an update on what I'm doing lately. Recently, I became the pastor of the Bath Church of the New Jerusalem in Bath, Maine, which means I'm back in the preaching business, which I was in for some time, and I go back and forth between that and teaching and medicine, and so that's what I do. And the Bath Church, Google it. It's a wonderful little place, and I just, as always happens, stumbled into that, and it was a wonderful thing. So, I'm that. I'm also the director of a very small, director is kind of a funny title, a very small discussion group that I have at my home in Saco, Maine, which is right on the coast, just south of Portland. And it's called the Samara Center for Practical Spirituality, which means just that. And a Samara is a seed, it's a biology term, botany. It's a seed with wings. So we take these ideas and we just give them away. You can't join my thing. You just have to come. And because we want you to go away and have fun with the ideas. And then I'm also still in medical practice a little bit, and I have a practice that I named Maine Constitutional Medicine, based on the ancient Greek notion that if you want to change your health, you have to change your constitution. Your constitution is the things you believe and live by. And that means you're going to have to quit eating grease and beef and eggs and things, and that's what my practice is. It's kind of a integrative medicine, osteopathic thing. So I'm having a lot of fun. The topic is intelligent default, which I'm going to explain to you, obviously. I've been working on this topic. With the topic is form. I've been working on this topic for years, maybe 40 years, I don't remember. But it started with my interest in comparative anatomy as an undergraduate. It was my favorite course. And then embryology, it was my favorite course. And then developmental biology, pre-molecular genetics, and it was exciting business back then. And then molecular biology, post-molecular genetics, because now molecular biology is pretty much genetics of development. But I did both. I managed to get into both of those. And then finally I moved on to spiritual concepts of the human, form, divine, because form is human. What I finally found out. So I'm interested in morphogenesis, which means the coming into being of forms, and then form itself. Now, she's not in here, but many thanks to Lisa Childs for helping organize this whole thing. It's a lot of work on her part. And as always, when something goes well, you never notice it. So thank you. Be sure to tell her thank you very much. And I want to thank Charlie Cole. He can't be here today because he's in the spiritual world, and he's really the reason I'm here, and he's why I'm talking about this. So I met him in October of October 1990. I came down here to interview for the theological school, but because of circumstances, I was also interviewing to be a biology professor. Things, as they say, things like that happen to me every day. And I met this guy named Charlie. I didn't know him. And then he took me back to the airport. And on the way back to the airport, we talked about form. And because that's the topic of the lecture I did that time, just as a tryout. And he picked up on that. So he gave me this at the airport. We're sitting there waiting. Now remember, Charlie used to make books. He would make them by copying books. Okay? Xerox copy of a book by Edmund Sinnott, who was a giant of pre-genetics developmental biology. He wanted to know about form. Okay? And so he made these books. He would copy the book. He didn't care about copyrights. And then he would make a cover and then put the thing on there and glue it all up and give them to people, students. So he gave me that day, and we sat in the airport, talked about form. Well, I was hooked. Here I am. So I just wanted you to know that. There was inspiration for this topic in my life that goes way, way back, and it goes very deep. So thank you to everyone as far as that goes. Now, here's a little abstract. There's something that was on the program which is perfectly accurate. This is kind of a personal abstract on my part. And it tells you how do I do that? It tells you what I'm doing. I work with the human form. I'm a physician, have been for years. I work with the human form, and I know that the more I know about the human form, the better I can serve my patients. Plan, get them well. Okay, so the better it makes sense. Now, embryology is a good way to learn about the human form. That's only half the story, because form, I found out here, flows in from somewhere else. It drives the embryo to completion. And from where, the question was and is, where is this somewhere else? And who's doing the driving? Well, Swedenborg said you'll find it deep within, and he called that thing, stuff, he called it formative substance, and it's alive. That's the good part. So we need to know that. Now, as a good teacher, I highlighted the key words, and there will be an exam, but a short one at the end. I want to just briefly introduce these concepts. Human form. Form is human. All natural forms are human. I want to talk about that. And influx, this spiritual flows into the natural. It flows. It doesn't come in. It's not installed. It flows. It drives things to completion. This is a completely teleological notion. So if you're an atheist, fine, but I'm not. It's a teleological notion that says this drives development of all things towards a perfect human form. We never get there, but that's where we're headed. And then Swedenborg, of course, has more to say about that than anyone I've ever found. The stuff that flows in, he called formative substance, which is a wonderful term because it's substantial. This stuff that flows in is stuff, and it forms. And so I love that term. He uses that term several times in his pre-theological works. And it's alive. What flows in? I'm going to talk about this. 4 things flow in. Life, form, rationality, and freedom. Those all come from somewhere else. Pretty much everything else comes from the earth. So I'm with the atheists on that, but this is different. Way different. Now, why Emanuel Swedenborg? Well, I tell people, he's the only one I have found that put everything together. Science. Even elements of my osteopathy come from him. Embryology, spirituality, theology. It's all together in a package with Emanuel Swedenborg. So that's why. Now, the founders of my profession were A.T. Still and another man named William Garner Sutherland. They came up with some marvelous stuff, some metaphysically edged stuff. But it turns out they were plugged in, okay? They were channeling Swedenborg too. Now, how do I know that? Well, thanks to our own David Fuller, who's working at a youth soccer thing this morning in the snow, so he couldn't be here. But thanks to our own David Fuller, he told us that. He showed us the influence of Emanuel Swedenborg's mostly pre-theological stuff on A.T. Still, William Garner Sutherland, and set them on a course to establish osteopathy as a method of healing with a metaphysical base, strictly Swedenborgian. So he showed us that. So he did that. Now, that book is published by the Swedenborg Scientific Association. All right? I'm the president of that thing, and I would invite you to join us. We need members like everybody else. We need support. But we do things like this. We publish those books. Now, we also publish Swedenborg's scientific works, and it turns out on the entire planet, we are the only ones who do. So we're very self-important about that little point. The fact is, that's us, and that's what we do. And I really do think you might want to join us. Now, Swedenborg Scientific Association, keeping the books in print since 1896. Keep that in mind. Now, all of Swedenborg's works, all of them, scientific, philosophical, theological, address one central question. He wants to know, what's the deal with all of this? What is all of this? It's a cool picture. I got it a long time ago. This being the universe, its beginnings, its workings, its purpose, what runs it, who runs it. He wants to know all of that. This is a slide of what's called universal expansion. And if I had a pointer, I would point to the beginning, at the Big Bang, quantum fluctuations they call it. Then there's inflation, which is a good kind of inflation. And then there's more stuff. What happens is the universe then, that's a timeline, moves forward as it expands and condenses into matter and then into junk and then into planets and then into galaxies. He wanted to know all about that. But he also wanted to know what is on the other side of that Big Bang. Because he didn't see it starting there. He saw something. He saw something booming in and creating, but he saw behind that. So I want to know all about it. He assumes spiritual causation of nature. Why? He's a theistic science. He assumes that. Spirit and nature. He wants to know how they work. Soul, body. It's all the same to him. But he wanted to, as far as his answer goes, he had two essential requirements. He was very picky about this. Philosophy of his day and our day requires two things. He says, first of all, spirit must not be nature after it forms nature. Okay? Spirit comes in, forms nature. Well, that's got to be spirit in nature. Okay? Well, that's called pantheism. And that's a bad thing. It's a psychological dead end. Because if nature is God, then I am God. Kind of a nice thought, but not a good thought. Because that means you're God too. And so let's just don't go down that rabbit hole. Okay, but if that's pantheism, spirit and nature must interact in some way, because we need the action of the divine in nature to provide for providence, don't we? And then in the case of you and me, we need our personal spiritual freedom. So, we need this to be continuous, and we need this to be discontinuous at the same time. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm popping this thing. The nature of the nexus, that's this point where spirit comes into nature. The nature of the nexus is a big problem. Swedenborg nailed it, and I'll show you how. Now, that leads me to what I've been spending the last 53 years to figure out. It leads me to this, Swedenborg, let me back up to here. I want you to focus on those 2 points. What he requires is something that seems impossible. I want a nexus where things are connected, so we can have providence, we can have freedom, and the divine operating in nature. But it has to be disconnected and discontinuous because of freedom. Okay, I have to have those two things. Swedenborg spent 53 years trying to figure that out. He wrote 65 books or so trying to explain it. And he did a really good job. But as I found out early on, he didn't dispense answers like an ATM. Boom. His answers are there, but you know how he does. He's all over the map. He's back and forth. Like the founder of osteopathy, A.T. Still. He worked at his own pace, and he followed his own interests, and they led him in different ways, and he's always digressing to different areas that interest him, and he didn't work in a straight line. So to find the answers he has left us, we have to just keep digging and find those answers where they lie buried. And they do lie there, buried. Now, throughout my career, at this point, crazy as it sounds, almost 50 years, I've always followed the same kinds of questions. I was led that way by my teachers. In undergraduate zoology, that's what I was interested in. Graduate school, zoology. Osteopathic medical school. My osteopathic practice. Theological school right here. And in my recent research, always I'm interested in causation. What makes that? In other words, what's this all about? Let's move back to causes. So, I found some answers over the years, but I could never put everything together. And I discovered Swedenborg 30 years ago now, and now finally I'm on to something I think worthwhile. My question that led to this, all these questions, led to this, which I wanted to show you. It's a research project I've been working on for, 6, 8 years. And I finally finished it. It's a dissertation for a PhD in theological studies, but my dissertation is on that topic. And it has to do with using Swedenborg's scientific principles and his doctrines and applying them to modern scientific problems. It's a really good dissertation, I'll tell you why. Look who the advisor was. If you ever want trouble, get a philosopher for your advisor. He'll ask you questions like, are you sure? Huh? What? He'll ask you questions like, can you document this? Can you prove this? And then he'll ask you questions. These are the ones that used to get me. Like, are you aware that William of Wessex said this in 1490? Who's William of Wessex? And he just over and over was causing me to tighten this thing up and make it work. And he has an undying love for Swedenborg's writings, but also an interest as a philosopher in these same pre-theological works. So we had a grand time doing all of this. So I'm done with it. It's all submitted, and I graduate in 4 weeks. That's it. That's the last time out. Because I found that at this age, I'm like a bucket with a hole in it. You can add new stuff in, but there's a lot of stuff going out. My poor old memory isn't what it used to be. So I think this will probably do it. Now, the question I attempt to answer in this dissertation is this. If Swedenborg can tell us about the nature of the nexus, and if this is a good description, then why can't we put this knowledge to use in modern science? Good idea. Hello, George. I didn't see you come in. Glad you're here. Okay, and I say we can do that. So I've put his ideas to work on the unsettled science of evolution. That's the whole purpose of this thing. If spirit comes into nature, forming nature as it comes, then there must be some feasible mechanism to explain it. Turns out, I believe there is. I call it intelligent default. Now, intelligent default is a play on words, of course, because for the last 10, 15, 20 years, some very smart theistic scientists have caused some excitement with their claims that there are structures and systems in living organisms that are just too complicated and too dependent on structural integrity to have come about by means of good old natural selection. And they've stated this in some very sophisticated scientific terms. I believe they're right in many cases. Many people believed them to be right. Now notice I said past tense, believed. Having made their observations and made their claims based on good science, they still cannot provide us with an alternative mechanism. Okay? Not even an educated guess on the nature of the nexus. Okay, that's not good. If I'm going to discredit your theory of natural selection based on what I'm calling good science, and then the next thing is there's this deep silence, and then the person says, okay, if it's not that, what is it? And these people cannot supply the answer. I'm not knocking them, I'm just saying this is where their program ends. It's a half a program. And this diminishes their program. Makes them look kind of like spoilers instead of scientists. They've stalled out while sitting on some really good science. The problem with that is when they write or when they speak and when they're cornered by people who are really questioning them, they resort to the idea that, yes, it's not this mechanism of evolution, and it's the divine is involved in it. God is involved some way. But see, this is beginning to sound like their detractors say, magic. See, it's all science, except there's something there that's kind of a miracle. I tried this once on an organic chemistry exam long ago. Dr. Tomasi did not buy it, and it didn't go well. I barely passed organic chemistry. Sorry, Erlen. It wasn't my favorite thing, but I liked what came next. Molecular biology was all good after that. But you can't use miracles in chemistry. Okay, so we can't have magic. Well, science had magic in it for decades. For millennia. A little science here, a little magic there, it all works out. But the problem is no magic since 1620. A guy named Francis Bacon turned off the magic. He devised a system that we now call science, and it was modern, it was new, it was powerful. How do you find out things about the natural world? And he said, well, we have to do it by eliminating the idea of the reason behind the thing. This would have been Aristotle's final cause. His four causes: material cause, efficient, formal, and final. Well, the final cause to a philosopher is the same as the end in the end, cause and effect. Bacon said, cause and effect, that's where we are. We're doing science. Only what our senses can reveal to us about the natural world, and this end thing, which is the purpose behind it all, can't do it. He didn't mean to do this like he did, but it was like goodbye magic and hello scientific materialism. Atheistic scientific materialism. I don't think Bacon intended that. He was a religious man, but he cut it all off. So he took the final cause away. And there we are, and there we've been since then. Science is totally atheistic. It's totally materialistic. And you're a fool if you believe otherwise. So, I'm a fool. I'm happy to be one. There is a way. Swedenborg's powerful doctrines, plus my own osteopathic principles, provide the components for a new metaphysical paradigm of form and function without an ounce of magic. We don't need it. What do we use? You ever heard of these? Of course, we talk about them a lot, or I do anyway, and we all know and love them. Swedenborg's doctrines, they're powerful doctrines. They explain natural phenomena and why things work the way they do. I'm going to talk about them a little bit at a time. They are the things that are important here: the doctrine of influx, the doctrine of degrees and series, doctrine of forms, and of course the doctrine of correspondence. Now let's take these one at a time to see what they are. I think our problem with using these and learning about them is we learn about them in isolation. We talk about doctrine of degrees. Fine. Then we talk about influx. Good. Nobody talks about forms, because the first time you read it doesn't mean anything. They just skip over that. And then they talk about correspondences. But I found that if you talk about them all at the same time, what you get is a huge system that works. So let's talk about them a little bit at a time. Now, influx. We talk about influx. Now, from my point of view, and I'm looking at this from a scientific perspective, influx is spiritual substance. I got that term from Swedenborg. It flows across the nexus. That's the crossing point where spirit comes into nature and into the natural. What does it bring? It brings form, life, rationality, and freedom. I said that before. Now, I think influx works like a coaxial cable. You know the cable that comes into your house? It brings all the garbage from the entertainment industry right into your living room. Isn't that something? And you pay for that stuff. Okay, coaxial cables can carry multiple signals at the same time. That's why they're neat. I have no idea how. Influx is a coaxial cable that carries 4 inputs at the same time. Form. What kind of form? Human form. Divine human form into nature. It brings life. See, life flows into receiving vessels. I think everyone here knows that. You know what? Out there, no one knows that. They think life is just a property of a living thing. Well, life does not come from living things. Life flows into living things. And it flows from one side through the nexus to the other. Rationality flows in. Isn't that interesting? It flows into all of nature. Some things can partake of a little rationality, some things can't. Humans are wonderful because we have a third degree of the mind that can actually partake of that total dose of rationality. It makes us humans. Now, some animals have a little rationality, kind of a linear kind of rationality. I had a dog, Jasper, who I thought was pretty highly evolved, but he was linear. You could fool him pretty easy, you see. 1, 2, 3. But I was a lay minister once in 1988, and I used to work all day, come home, and start my sermons at around 9 at night. And I would sit up. Of course, I was quite young then, and I could do this. I would sit up all night making this sermon, and then I'd have to practice it. So nobody was awake at like 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning. So Jasper would sit there and just listen to me do my sermon. He just would sit there. You know how dogs are. He thought I was talking to him. So he heard like 30 sermons. And this dog he was really a blissful dog. But he died. And anyway, how'd I get there? Oh, rationality. He was kind of rational, but not like me. And so but it flows in. That's one of the things coming in through the coax. Okay, what else? Freedom. Now, why would it be flowing in? Well, nature is random. You say, oh, no, there's order in nature. Yes, but there is a certain randomness about nature that's essential if we're going to have things like evolution. So that's the apparent randomness, is freedom flowing in, and then spiritual freedom for you and me. So it's very important stuff. So far, so good. But how does influx descend? If that's what it is, and we know where it comes from, and how does it do that? This is Swedenborg's main question. Well, it flows in by degrees. We know that. Well, David Bohm in 1980, I believe, kind of led the charge for the new science. He said there was an implicate order in the universe. He said it was installed like an operating system, running underneath the workings of nature. Well, we know that from TCR 53, God is order itself. Well, that's what David Bohm was talking about. And he says, no, he doesn't say, I say, Swedenborg says the descent of this influx is by discrete degrees, which is stair steps, just like those. And it's like a ladder where one level is above and one level below, all the way up and down. That's essential. What's the purpose of degrees? For keeping order. If everything was just in a jumble, things would be disorderly, wouldn't they? It'd be chaotic. So with degrees, you can, if you think about ladders, you can only go up a ladder one step at a time, safely, and down. And if there's, say, 2 or 3 people on a ladder, you got to space yourselves out. We can't all climb the same place in the ladder. We'll fall off. That's disorderly. So ladders require order. Ladders bring order. Degrees bring order into this universe. Now, think about levels. And this is another way to see discrete degrees. In a whole organism like yourself, you are all of you. Then you have organs, and those organs have lobes, and those lobes have lobules. And those, now we got to get a microscope out. Those lobules have cells. Cells have organelles. Organelles, one of the organelles is the nucleus. Inside the nucleus is a big, long, wrapped up strand of DNA made of bases, which are big molecules. But if you break those molecules down, they're atoms. The atoms are made of what they call leptons, which are just the parts of atoms, like neutrons, protons, and electrons. Okay? They're pretty easy to see for us. But then you get down below them, you can break them apart, and they're made of subatomic particles. And from there, who knows? What's the last stop? Well, it's the finest things of nature. Or is that the first stop? Good question. So think levels. There's a hierarchical cascade in all of us called the fascial organ, called the matrix. It's investing all the components of all those levels right down to the very smallest level, fibers, providing an instantaneous electromagnetic communication system for all parts. Instantaneous. Swedenborg knew all about it. He called it the peritoneum. You'll find it in the Dynamics of the Soul's Domain. It used to be called Economy of the Animal Kingdom. You'll find it. And yet, it's a communication from the whole right down to the smallest parts, down to the parts that are almost not there at all. So that's degrees. Degrees keep order. That's what degrees do. And we need order, okay? Forms. If you had seatbelts, I'd tell you to put it on right now, because forms are difficult. You find them in the fiber, which is a difficult book to begin with, and you'll find it in a little insert in the middle, and when you read it, which I've done many times, the first probably 3 times, it won't do you a bit of good. You realize, oh, nuts, I've got to back up and read the whole book. That's tough. So you do that, and you come to, you say, now I'll get it. So I say, man, that is tough stuff. But it's not. It's not, because he's using terminology that's unfamiliar, and he's using it as a philosopher, which is unfamiliar to our normal way of learning. But he uses terms, and I'm going to really rip through this because they're in your handout. You've got a handout. Okay, they're in that. Here's the point. These forms go from the most natural and solid, you might say, to all the way up to the divine. They're different forms to do functions at different levels of reality. Just think that. And then we'll just whip through them. Angular, the most imperfect or the most natural form. And it offers a structural impediment, which means it makes things solid. Okay? The next one up is spherical. And then he calls them other things too, but you can see that. That has no, well, this angular has angles. Okay? And then spherical is more round. So it would be more fluid, wouldn't it? Imagine a box of ball bearings. Okay, I want to pour them out. Good. Now, imagine a little box full of jacks. Remember what jacks are? Those little things? And you put them down and you bounce a red ball. Come on, tell me I'm not the only one who knows about jacks. Okay. They were for girls when I was a boy, but I had a sister, so I had jacks, and I liked to play jacks. And they're angular little things. They look like, I don't know, like little tank traps or something. The real purpose of jacks is to put in carpets so parents can step on them late at night and test their level of regeneration. The point is, try to pour out a box of jacks. It won't work. They get stuck. They clump together. This is the stuff the earth is made out of. This is carbon atoms. They're like jacks, okay? Then spherical is a little more fluid, not totally, more like maybe grade A amber syrup, maple syrup, on a cold day, okay? Out it comes. Then there's the spiral form, which is more, he always says more superior to the one before. More excellent, still more, okay. It's a form of active force, great. But we have not very pori, real little pori, real pori, okay. Then we have the celestial, which is a form superior to those, okay. Now what's the big deal about that? It's the first natural form. So we're moving towards the nexus here. We're moving back towards the nexus. Above it is the infinite, okay, and below it are the compound forms. So this is really the nitty-gritty right here. This might be the level of the nexus. Because above it, he says, is the infinite. That's got to be on the other side. And then below it are the compound forms, which are on our side. So it looks like maybe the celestial form is the form at the level of the nexus. It's a wonderful thought, anyway. Okay? More forms to come. Just think. Each form serves a purpose at a particular level of reality. Okay, and then I think I skipped a page. I did. Now, so we're here with the spiritual or perpetuo celestial. Okay. I don't know what I did with that page. Don't need it because I've got this thing. I don't know, I'm having one of those moments. It's a wonderful moment. Okay, forms. The fact is, spiritual or perpetual, whatever, the big deal that we're going up now, it's superior, greater than form. Now this is what I like. This is form in abstract. Are we on the same page? Yes, form in abstract. Contemplating all other forms in order outside itself in the same form in abstract. This is the origin of form. Above. Now remember, it's cascading down into the next one, into the next one, into the next one. And it's outside itself and at the same time in. It's pretty mystical sounding. The fact is, we are now outside of this world, but we're at a point where the form of this world is originating, flowing down. And finally, we have this divine form. Not properly a form, he says, but pure essence, life. This is the divine. That's the starting point. What kind of divine? Divine human form. There it is. So imagine these forms then as a dynamic cascade of intermediates translating spiritual into natural, okay, and each representing the degree of reality common to that level. It's a wonderful thing. So you think, again, hierarchy, macromolecules, molecules, atoms, leptons, quarks, force carriers, who knows? We're getting way down there. So, I know what happened. I went the other direction. So now we need to talk about correspondence. No, I don't want to review. There, correspondence. It is a functional link. We're going to find two links, functional and structural, okay? The forms are a structural kind of linking, because each is a structure of its own. He defines them very carefully. But then now we need a continuous kind of functional link if we're going to do any good. Because remember, we have to be attached and not attached. So the functional link is correspondence. And people always say this is the hardest doctrine to comprehend. I say, oh no, you should read the forms. You want something difficult. It's not difficult. It just requires application. You have to read and read and read. That's all. But it is hard. The correspondences are difficult because they're slippery. We know kind of how it works, but we don't know how it works. If the forms are structural between spirit and inert nature, and if one end of the cascade is inert matter down here, and the other end is spiritual, then we can see that some force must be at work to link two things. at both ends. This can't be structural totally, because pantheism, warning, pantheism, it's a kind of harmony between what the two things do. There's their function, it's their use, we might say. It's like sympathetic strings, okay? Or electromagnetic induction. It's a kind of harmony. And here's the most important part. In correspondence, one thing is the cause of the other thing. It doesn't work backwards. It always works in one direction. Now, harmony of things in nature and spirit, not a new idea. It goes back millennia. It's an old esoteric idea. In alchemy, there was a correspondence, they said, between the metals formed in the earth and the planets that influenced them at the time. All right, you got lead is Saturn, and the moon is Quicksilver or Mercury, and the sun, of course, influences gold, and on and on. And they worked out a system, but it's kind of corny, but it worked, it's okay. But Swedenborg comes along, and he takes this old ancient concept, and he just puts it on steroids. And he makes it useful to us in a way no one ever could. Correspondence is like the sympathetic strings on a sitar. Remember Ravi Shankar, anybody? Hippy Dippy Days? Most of those strings were just vibrating out of sympathy with other strings. He was a cool guy. And then think about electromagnetic induction or whatever. My favorite thought was, think about the correspondence between Mozart's Requiem Mass in D minor and your radio, which is an inert piece of stuff, right? Well, somewhere, it began in Mozart's mind, which then was attached to his brain, somehow got written down, somehow got recorded, somehow that recording got put in a box at the radio station, an electronic box. It went up a pole to an antenna. The signal, radio signal, went out. It comes to your radio. Okay, so far so good. I don't know how that works, but we believe it works. Then you turn it on, and there's the Mass, the Requiem Mass in D minor. So, one is the cause of the other. You can't send it back to the radio station. But they correspond. How do they correspond? Not in what they are, in what they do. They do that music. And so that's correspondence. One causes the other. Now, we're going to review a bit. It's in your handout. There it is. Human form flows in from somewhere else. It's formative. It's alive. Why Swedenborg? Well, he's everywhere. He answers questions other people cannot. He wants to know what the deal is with this stuff. The nexus must allow discontinuous and continuous communication. And Swedenborg has answers about the nature of the nexus. And if he does, we should be able to apply them to contemporary problems. And what the ID, or intelligent design scientists, came close to, they can't finish. Because they don't have a mechanism. But our new paradigm does. Okay? It's based on those doctrines that we just talked about. Now let's imagine all these things I just talked about. So far, words. We're big on words in this group. We have 65 volumes of words. How many illustrations are in those green books? How many illustrations are in those scientific books? None, really. A few here and there, but they're not good. And we have to just take it into our minds and make our own mental pictures. That's okay, but there's something that works with that. These ideas aren't new. None of these really are. They weren't new with Swedenborg, but he just understood the gist of them, and he explained them very well, and he developed them, and he put them to actual use. Let's translate these concepts into some sublime metaphysical images that will endure in our imaginations so that we won't forget this stuff. Okay, we need that. Words are great. Philosophy, wonderful stuff. Swedenborg's descriptions of these things are powerful, persuasive, but there are no images to stir my senses. Now, the best people I've run across who give us images for metaphysical concepts are the Kabbalists, the Jewish mystics. They love to make pictures. God bless them, because they make wonderful pictures. And when they don't do pictures, they tell stories. Wonderful people. Okay, influx in human form. I've said that twice, 3 times. What does that mean? Well, if you're a Kabbalist, whoa, now you've got a picture. And it's not just a picture, it's one of those pictures. And it stays in your mind. Because here's creation from the top, that's the God, unknowable God, coming down by discrete degrees, steps, okay? Coming down, and creation is at the bottom, that last step called Malkut. Whoa, it's female. I'm not even getting into that. And then you have all these levels, and then what Sony said at 9, look at what the first thing is out of the hatch is judgment. Okay? Hokmah, judgment or wisdom. And then comes understanding over on the other side. You got to have understanding. We still haven't done any good. You take an angle down and you find mercy. You've got to mix the judgment with the mercy. These people were all over this concept. But there are your discrete degrees, and they stuck a human in the middle of it. Because they said that human is called Adam Kadmon. Whoa, what does that mean? Primordial human. Hey, well, let's put that in Latin. How about Maximus Homo? Same idea. Creation in human form. Now that you've seen that, you know that creation is in human form, and you know kind of what it sort of looks like. Okay, that's a wonderful thing. Degrees of order. I said before, degrees are like steps or a ladder. When I think of a ladder, I think of my blue ladder at home that I'm not allowed to get on without my wife somewhere in the vicinity. Okay, I fell off the roof once. That's the story. But there's a better ladder. Jacob's ladder. Of course. And Jacob's ladder is a story that is so powerful that it will never leave our mind. This is degrees of order for ascent and descent, for spiritual natural interaction. Jacob's dream of that ladder from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it, is an archetype, you might say, of spiritual natural nexus. It's also an archetype of the structure of the human mind. Same thing when you think about it. So there is something we will never forget. And notice that the angels are in order going up and down that ladder. They'd have to be or they would fall off. And I don't think these angels even have, they've got wings, but they could be okay if they fell off. But we know angels don't have wings. They would fall off of that ladder if they all tried to crowd up the ladder at the same time or come down and up at the same time. Won't work. Discrete degrees. Jacob's ladder. Now the forms, this is tough. What are we going to get for forms? Well, Plato had that nailed. He had these things called Platonic solids. He got them from the pre-Socratics. Who knows who actually made these up? But we have Platonic solids or cosmic figures, and what they represented in the ancient world were levels of creational reality. Well, that's interesting. That's what Swedenborg is calling forms. Do you suppose he had ever heard of Plato and his solids? Probably. Okay, so they're levels of creational reality, and I can't use my pointer, but the smallest one is a tetrahedron. That's that angular form, incidentally. And then we have, to those guys, they represent fire, earth, water, air. Notice we're getting rounder and rounder and rounder. That's exactly what Swedenborg said. And then that last one is really round. It would roll like a ball. And he says, Plato says, that last form, the dodecahedron, he said the gods use this for arranging the constellations of the whole heavens, whatever that means. But he's attaching this from natural at the bottom to some sort of spiritual at the top. There are Swedenborg's forms in a picture. But that was then. That served Plato pretty well. What about now? What could we visualize for form? Whoa, there's some forms. And those are good ones. Quantum physicists are beginning to catch on. Here are Plato's solids and Swedenborg's forms in 2016. And they are arranged by ascending and descending degrees of order. And the best thing about this, over on the right, those big red blobby things are called bosons. They're the best ones because they are perpetual vortical or celestial forms, I believe. They disappear, or they appear and disappear as needed to bring particles together into larger particles. They do work. And they come from somewhere else. And that's been established, and everybody just wonders about that. They are hopping across the nexus, bringing the first forms of nature into nature. And that was from that level where forms are born. So there is the new picture, you might say, image of the solids, of the forms. And they make sense that way. And at that level, matter is actually coming in across the nexus, aggregating into larger and larger clumps, and then clumps with clumps, and bigger clumps, and the next thing you know, we've got leptons, we've got electrons, protons, and neutrons, we're building atoms, and we're on our way to building a universe. Okay, that's good. And finally, correspondence. What image would we use for correspondence? Well, I went to the alchemist for that because this is just the best image you ever saw. Doesn't mean much, but look at what's going on there. There's spiritual at the top, natural at the bottom, people hopping around all over the place. We got animals, we've got, looks like angels up there, and it's all happening at once in a dynamic system where this corresponds to this. And that's something we need to understand. Action at a distance is what it's all about. Has been the greatest mystery. It is not anymore. Correspondence works hand in hand with the forms, one structural, that's forms, one functional, that's correspondence, working together to cross that nexus to bring about continuous creation. There's one more thing. All these particles that form, these intermediates, even bosons, sometimes aren't really there at all. They all of them behave according to laws. What do I mean? Natural laws. What are natural laws? Well, to a physicist or any scientist, they're like the four forces of nature. They're like gravity. They're like thermodynamic laws, electromagnetic laws, the speed of light. Remember that bumper sticker? Not just a good idea, it's the law. Okay, it is the law. The conservation of energy, bond distances, quantum levels, attention, attraction and repulsion, valence. I could go on and on. All of these laws define the limits of behavior for natural matter. That's what they do. Matter can't do stuff that the laws don't allow. Okay? All right. Or how parts interact with other parts. They do it according to laws. We kind of know this. This is the definition of form. Form's not shape. Form is how parts interact with other parts. That's the form of a thing. Shape just happens after matter follows its own laws. Everything in nature just happens when matter follows its own laws. And it can't not do that. All right? So put a ring around that in your handout. That's the most important thing. It can't not do that. All of nature follows laws. So this form is imposed on nature by the form inherent in the spiritual influx that is flowing in. That's where the rules come from. As Swedenborg and Isaac Luria and the Kabbalists all knew, this is the human form divine. Forms in nature are not by accident. They're not designed, which implies something pushing things around or sculpting or bending or something. They're not designed. That would be magic, and we don't have magic anymore. Remember? Forms, evolving forms, developing embryos, display a default setting for matter in this world. It's a default setting. It can't be any other way. It is intelligent default, for sure, because it comes from somewhere else. And it's from the inside out. Now, knowing this, we can finally begin to understand what is the deal with all of this. Evolution, adaptation, development, all of that. So, there's more in the handout. There are 3 people I just want to mention. 3 scientists, all of whom are materialistic scientists, all of whom are, I'm sure, atheistic, who actually helped me in all of this. Stephen Jay Gould, a monster expert on evolution, he said it's not micro, it's macro evolution. And that becomes important, and I'll somewhere in that summary it's there. And he said that's important, just take my word for it. And then Stephen Wolfram, one of my favorite guys, says that the origin of complexity in nature is not from greater complexity, but from incredibly simple starting points. And if you get down to the nexus, nothing could be more simple than those little particles that are barely there. Well, all of science says the opposite. Must come from more and more and more and more complexity. Wrong, comes from a simple. And then lastly, a guy named Kaufman, who's kind of the father of what they call emergence, finds that complex systems exist on or just in the phase transition in the ordered regime near the, what's he talking about? A region that is between too much order and not enough order, chaos. And from that region in living things, we find we find form emerging, the emergence of form. And this guy, he's talking about spiritual influx, but he won't talk about it. He just goes right around it. And I've never talked to him, but he's talking about what I'm talking about. So these three guys really helped me a lot. Thank you very much to them. They didn't know they were helping a person who's doing theistic science. So finally, in your handout is a grand summary, a rationale for a theistic theory of evolution. And I'm going to stand here and read it to you. We're about done. And you can read. I know you can read because we're all students of Swedenborg. But it just rehashes what I've said. Human form flows in, formative substance. It forms as it comes. It flows into things that can receive it to their level of that they can receive it. And inherent in the form are constraining parameters. We call them physical laws. Okay? And that world of forms that is so abstract when you read it in the fiber, that's just a little world, that's the quantum world. I don't know if it's little, it's probably enormous. So that, oh good, that's not me. The world of forms is the quantum world. And Kaufman's world of emergence, well, that stuff is coming from somewhere else, he just doesn't discuss it. And you add energy to this whole thing, and compounds will build up into more and more complex forms. That's what Wolfram tells us, according to these what? Inherent rules of interaction. Now this compounding is kind of random to the degree that it accords with inherent rules of order. So there's randomness in nature. Need that. That's called freedom. And then Wolfram says it can build up from the simplest starting points. That's Swedenborg's simple, which is the first natural point, which just popped over from the spiritual world. Hello, one dimension here, just going in a circle. You can't see me, but I'm going to build up into all things of nature according to the laws I brought with me, the laws of human form. So, matter responds to this influx, just like you would expect, builds up as it's able, coming into the human form as completely as it can. Swedenborg says all things of creation participate in this human form. And the more complex the thing, the more human it is. Okay? I'm more human than a salamander, which is more human than a fern, which is more human than a rock, but they're all in the human form when you get that. So, you allow this whole system to work, and on any terrestrial planet you would have organisms, you would have influx into those organisms, and eventually humans with rational minds who could participate in eternity. Now the problem is, this is a new thing. And as I said in my handout, this is not your grandmother's theory of evolution. New ideas are not always met with joy. Sometimes people are kind of skeptical. My grandmother never looked like that. They were nice ladies. But this lady's looking at me like, what are you talking about? Well, there's always resistance to new ideas. I don't mind, but why should your grandmother be so surprised? As we all know, he who sat on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. And there you go. Thank you.